For 6 million years, a river carved its will into stone, and no one thought to stop it. This is the story of Hoover Dam and of the river it was built to hold the Colorado, a waterway that had spent longer than human memory could measure, grinding its way through rock, indifferent to whatever stood in its path. Before there were nations to name it, before there were engineers to imagine taming it, the river simply moved and moved and moved, carrying sediment the color of rust and clay down through highlands and deserts until it reached the sea. It did this in flood and in drought, in seasons of terrifying abundance and seasons of near nothing, and it answered to no calendar that a farmer or a city could depend upon. To stand at the edge of the Colorado during the spring melt, in the years before anyone had thought to restrain it, was to witness something closer to a moving mountain than a stream. Snow gathered in the high country of what would become Colorado and Wyoming and Utah, packed deep across winter, and then, as the days lengthened, it began to give itself back to the world. All at once, the melt did not trickle, it surged. In weeks, the river could rise by many feet, swelling with a violence that uprooted trees, swept away sandbars, and reshaped its own banks as if erasing a rough draft. Downstream, in the arid stretches where the water finally reached cultivated land, this was both a blessing and a menace. A blessing because it was the only water for hundreds of miles in any direction, and a menace because no one could say from one year to the next whether it would arrive as a gift or as a catastrophe. The river had already proven more than once that it did not recognize human ambition. In the early years of the 20th century, an irrigation canal meant to draw a modest share of the Colorado into California's Imperial Valley failed to hold the river back during a period of high water, and the Colorado poured through the breach for months, abandoning its old channel entirely and rushing instead into a dry basin far below sea level. What formed there, called the Salton Sea, was not planned by any engineer. It was simply what the river did when it found an opening. Proof, if proof were needed, that this was not a waterway to be casually redirected. It had reminded an entire agricultural region in the span of a single flood season that it was still the one in command. And yet this same river, so vast in its power and so careless of human plans, had also spent its entire existence performing one slow, patient labor, cutting downward. Over the course of millions of years, as the Colorado Plateau rose beneath it through the grinding of tectonic plates, the river held its course and simply continued to cut deeper and deeper through rock that had itself been laid down in ancient seas long before there were animals with spines to swim in them. Layer upon layer of sandstone and limestone and shale, in colors that shifted with the light, rust, ochre, rose, a pale and ghostly white, were sliced through by a current that never stopped working. This was the labor that produced the Grand Canyon, and it was the same principle, the same patient violence, that had carved 1,000 smaller canyons along the river's route, including one narrow, sun-blasted gorge on the border between Nevada and Arizona that history would eventually come to know by name. It was here, in this remote defile of dark volcanic and metamorphic rock, that engineers of the 1920s and 30s would eventually choose to build. But long before there were surveyors with their instruments, before there was a name attached to any dam at all, Black Canyon was simply one of the loneliest and most hostile places in the American West. It sat far from any city, far from any railway line, reachable only by descending through desert terrain that offered no shade and little water beyond what the river itself provided. Water that was, at the time, unsafe to drink without settling out its heavy load of silt. Summer temperatures in the canyon could climb past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough that metal tools left in the sun became too hot to hold bare-handed. hot enough that a man could suffer heat stroke simply standing still. The canyon walls rose steeply on either side, close enough in places that the sun reached the river only briefly each day, and the wind, when it came, arrived not as relief, but as another assault, carrying dust and grit that stung any exposed skin. Rattlesnakes were common along the canyon's ledges. Scorpions sheltered beneath the same rocks that offered the only shade for miles. There was no easy way in and no easy way out, and for generations, this had been reason enough for the region to remain almost entirely unvisited, except by surveyors mapping the river's course and prospectors chasing rumors of ore. It was by any reasonable measure one of the worst possible places to attempt a large construction project, remote, punishing, and built from rock so hard and uneven that even reaching a stable foundation would require blasting away enormous quantities of stone. And yet it was precisely here, in this narrow, furnace-hot gorge, that men would eventually attempt something that no civilization before them had accomplished at this scale. They would build a wall of concrete tall enough and strong enough to stop the Colorado River entirely. And behind that wall, they would gather a lake larger than any reservoir ever created by human hands up to that point in history. River that had spent 6 million years cutting downward, unbothered by drought or flood or the ambitions of farmers, would be made, through concrete, through steel, through the calculated patience of engineers who had never before built anything quite like it, to pause. This was Hoover Dam, though it would not carry that name easily, nor would its construction proceed without doubt, delay, and argument over both its purpose and its very possibility. It rose, eventually, as a curved wall of concrete more than 700 feet high, set directly into the bedrock of Black Canyon, and behind it, the river would back up for more than 100 miles, filling the canyons upstream to form Lake Mead. Reservoir capable of holding back roughly 9 trillion gallons of water when full, an amount so large that for decades after its completion, no other reservoir built by human hands could rival it. To hold back such a volume in such a remote and hostile place, using concrete as the primary material, was not simply an engineering challenge. It was, in the most literal sense, an attempt to answer a problem that had confronted the communities of the American Southwest for centuries. A river too violent to trust, and a desert too dry to survive without it. Understanding how this happened, how a river that had shaped a landscape for millions of years came to be held at last by a structure of human design, requires understanding first what the land itself demanded. It requires returning to the early decades of the 20th century, to farmers whose crops depended on a river they could not predict, to cities beginning to stretch across a landscape with no reliable water of its own, and to a growing recognition, slow and reluctant, that the Colorado could not simply be lived alongside. It would have to be controlled, or the communities depending on it would remain forever at its mercy. That recognition, and the long argument over who would build a solution and how, forms the beginning of this story, the story of engineers who believed a dam of this scale was possible before anyone had proof that it was, of workers who labored in heat that killed some of them and marked all of them, and of a structure that still stands today, quiet and enormous, in a canyon that was once thought too remote and too hostile for anything built by human hands to survive. Before continuing further into that history, if you find comfort in these long, unhurried accounts of the structures that shaped the world we now take for granted, consider subscribing to this channel, where more such stories are gathered slowly, one great structure at a time. The river, in those early years before the dam, gave no indication that it could ever be persuaded to behave otherwise. It rose in spring and starved in autumn. It flooded fields one year and left them cracked and dry the next. Along its lower reaches, where the desert offered nothing of its own, entire communities lived and died by its uncertain moods, and the idea that this river might one day be held in place by concrete, measured, scheduled, released according to human need rather than its own ancient rhythm would have seemed, to most who lived along its banks in those years, less like engineering and more like myth. And yet the myth, however unlikely, was already beginning to take shape in the minds of the engineers who would eventually descend into Black Canyon and begin the long work of making it real. In the early years of the 20th century, the American Southwest was a region defined as much by absence as by presence. An absence of consistent rain, of dependable rivers, of the settled infrastructure that older parts of the nation had spent generations building. What water did exist arrived on terms no engineer or farmer could predict. And nowhere was this truer than in the Imperial Valley of Southern California, a stretch of desert so dry that early surveyors had dismissed it as unfit for anything but sand and heat. And yet, the soil beneath that sand, when it received water, proved extraordinarily fertile, dark, and rich in the way that only long-buried silt can be carried down over centuries by the very river that refused to be tamed. Settlers who arrived in the valley in the first decade of the new century saw in it the possibility of transforming desolation into abundance, provided the Colorado could be persuaded to share its water in something like a reliable measure. Canals were dug, some by private companies working with more ambition than caution, drawing water directly from the river through a series of headworks that assumed, perhaps too easily, that the Colorado's behavior in any given season would resemble its behavior in the last. It did not. In 1905, following a period of heavy snowmelt and unusually persistent flooding upstream, the river breached its diversion channels entirely and began pouring, almost in its totality, into the low basin of the valley. What followed was not a single flood, but a sustained inundation that lasted for months, the Colorado essentially changing course and creating, in the place of the intended farmland, a new inland sea. That sea would come to be called the Salton Sea, and though it eventually became a landmark in its own right, its creation stood at the time as a stark demonstration of what happened when human ambition met a river that had never been asked and had certainly never agreed to behave predictably. Engineers labored for nearly 2 years to force the Colorado back into its old channel, work that consumed enormous sums of money and no small number of lives, and even after the river had been coaxed back to something resembling its former course, the lesson of those years lingered. The valley's farmers had seen, in the clearest possible terms, that the river which gave them their livelihood could just as easily take it away, and that no amount of local ingenuity, however determined, was equal to the task of controlling a watercourse whose drainage basins spanned nearly 250,000 square miles across 7 states and reached into a neighboring nation besides. The floods of 1905 were not an isolated event, so much as a particularly dramatic instance of a pattern that had repeated itself in smaller and larger forms for as long as anyone had kept records along the lower Colorado. In wet years, the river swelled with snowmelt from the Rocky Mountains and ran high and fast and brown with sediment, overtopping its banks and reshaping its own channel with a violence that made permanent settlement along its immediate course a genuine hazard. In dry years, by contrast, the same river could shrink to a fraction of its flood volume, leaving canals dry, crops withering, and communities that had built their economies around irrigation suddenly facing ruin from the opposite direction. This volatility was not a flaw to be corrected by better local management. It was a structural feature of the river itself, tied to the vast and irregular snowpack of the mountains that fed it, and no community living downstream possessed the resources or the authority to address a problem that began hundreds of miles beyond its own borders. The Imperial Valley's farmers understood this earlier and more painfully than most, but they were far from alone. Across the 7 states through which the Colorado and its tributaries passed, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and California, communities large and small had begun to recognize that their futures were tied to a river, and that any lasting solution would have to rise above the level of local ditches and private canal companies. At the same time that irrigation was drawing attention to the river's unpredictability, a second and equally pressing need was beginning to shape the national conversation, and that was the need for electricity. The early decades of the 20th century saw explosive growth across the American Southwest, particularly in Southern California, where cities like Los Angeles were expanding at a pace that outstripped almost every existing utility. Populations were multiplying, industries were arriving, and the demand for reliable electric power was growing in step with them, straining what limited generating capacity existed in the region. The Colorado River, for all its danger as an uncontrolled watercourse, represented an extraordinary potential source of power if its flow could be regulated and directed through turbines rather than simply allowed to run wild toward the sea. Here again, the river's very unpredictability was the obstacle. A power plant built to rely on the river's natural flow would be at the mercy of the same floods and droughts that had ruined the valley's early canals, generating excess and unusable power during high water and falling dangerously short during periods of drought. What the growing cities of the Southwest needed was not simply access to the river, but control over it, the ability to store its floodwaters during wet years and release them steadily during dry ones, smoothing out the natural chaos of its flow into something a modern electrical grid and a modern agricultural economy could depend upon. The scale of such an undertaking, however, was far beyond what any single state or private company could reasonably attempt, and this reality set the stage for one of the more delicate political negotiations of the era. The 7 states of the Colorado River Basin each had legitimate claims on the river's water, and each understandably feared that a large-scale storage project built without clear legal agreement would allow whichever state moved fastest, most likely California, with its booming population and its powerful political voice, to claim the lion's share of the river's flow for itself, leaving the less populous upstream states with insufficient water for their own future growth. Negotiations among the 7 states began in earnest in the early 1920s, culminating in a series of meetings that produced what became known as the Colorado River Compact, an agreement that divided the river's water rights between an upper basin and a lower basin, allocating a fixed share to each and leaving the individual states within those basins to work out further arrangements among themselves. The compact was not without controversy, and Arizona in particular resisted ratifying it for years, wary of California's growing influence and uncertain that its own interests had been adequately protected. But the compact, however imperfectly received, represented something genuinely new, an acknowledgement, given legal and political weight, that the Colorado River could not be treated as the private resource of whichever state happened to reach it first, and that any large engineering project undertaken on the river would need to operate within a framework that all the affected states had at least nominally agreed to. It was against this backdrop, floods that had already proven capable of drowning an entire valley, a growing regional hunger for electricity that no existing plant could satisfy, and a fragile but real political agreement dividing the river's water among competing states, scale that had no true precedent in American engineering. This would not be a local canal or a modest diversion dam of the kind that had already failed so dramatically in the Imperial Valley. It would need to be a structure capable of holding back the entire annual flood of one of the continent's most volatile rivers, storing that water through dry seasons and dry years alike, and simultaneously generating enough electrical power to serve a rapidly growing swath of the American Southwest. Such a project would require resources, authority, and engineering expertise that no state government and no private corporation could plausibly assemble on its own. It would require the involvement of the federal government, acting not merely as a regulator or a distant authority, but as the direct builder and owner of the structure itself, a role the government had rarely, if ever, taken on at this scale within its own borders. By the middle of the 1920s, the pieces of this ambition had largely fallen into place, even if the precise engineering details remained unresolved. The states had reached, however uneasily, a compact governing the division of water. The cities of the Southwest had made their need for power unmistakably clear. The floods of the previous decades had demonstrated, in terms no one could dismiss, the cost of leaving the river ungoverned. What remained was the question of whether the engineering of the era was equal to the task being asked of it, whether concrete and steel and human labor could genuinely accomplish what the river's long, unpredictable history seemed to suggest. There was, in the political and public conversation of those years, a quiet but growing sense that the attempt would be made regardless of the answer, that the river's threat to the valley and the region's hunger for power had together created a momentum that no amount of caution could fully hold back. The nation needed water it could rely upon and light it could count on through every season, and increasingly it seemed there was only one place capable of delivering both. A narrow, steep-walled gorge along the Arizona-Nevada border known as Black Canyon, where the Colorado ran deep and fast between walls of ancient volcanic rock, though no one could yet say exactly how, to be transformed from the site of a natural hazard into the foundation of a national ambition. The task of turning that ambition into a structure fell, in the end, to a federal agency still young enough to be finding its own methods as it went. The Bureau of Reclamation had spent the better part of 2 decades building irrigation works across the American West. Modest dams and diversion channels meant to coax water onto dry farmland, and nothing in its history had prepared it, or perhaps anyone, for a project of the scale now being contemplated in Black Canyon. The engineers who gathered to consider the problem were not unaccustomed to difficult ground or difficult rivers, but they understood in the quiet way that careful men understand the edges of their own experience, that what was being asked of them now exceeded anything the agency had attempted before. A dam that might rise more than 700 feet from bedrock to crest was not simply a larger version of what had come before. It was a different order of problem altogether, one that would test not only the strength of materials, but the adequacy of the mathematics being used to describe them. At the center of this effort stood a small number of men whose names would in time become inseparable from the dam itself, though in these early years they were mostly known only within the narrow circles of federal engineering. There was Elwood Meade, the commissioner, whose name the reservoir would eventually carry, a man given to careful, deliberate judgment and disinclined toward overstatement. There was John L. Clark Savage, the Bureau's chief design engineer, whose long career had already carried him across dam sites throughout the West, and who now found himself tasked with translating an almost unprecedented ambition. And there were dozens of draftsmen, hydrologists and geologists working in offices in Denver and Los Angeles, hunched over slide rules and hand-drawn cross-sections, trying to imagine, in the flat abstraction of blueprint paper, a structure that did not yet exist anywhere on Earth at the scale now being proposed. Their first and most persistent difficulty was one of sheer disbelief, both their own and that of the wider engineering community watching from a cautious distance. Concrete as a building material was reasonably well understood by the early 20th century. Engineers had poured it into bridges, into buildings, to smaller dams scattered throughout the American West and Europe, and they had developed, over decades of trial, a working sense of how it behaved as it cured, how it drew strength from a slow chemical reaction between cement and water, how it hardened not instantly, but over weeks and months and even years, gradually approaching something close to the strength of stone. What they had never confronted, not at this scale, was the particular problem that arose when enormous volumes of the material were placed together at once. Concrete does not cure quietly. As cement reacts with water, it releases heat, a fact well known to any mason who had ever poured a modest foundation and felt the faint warmth rising from it in the days after. In a small pour, that heat dissipates readily into the surrounding air, drawn away almost as quickly as it appears, leaving little trace beyond a slight warmth to the touch. But the dam being proposed for Black Canyon was not a modest pour. It called for concrete in a volume difficult to hold in the mind, enough by some calculations to pave a highway stretching across the entire continental breadth of the country. If such a mass were poured as a single continuous block, as engineers might ordinarily have proceeded, the heat generated by its curing would have nowhere to escape. It would build steadily inward, trapped at the center of the structure, and the resulting temperatures, engineers feared, could reach levels sufficient to prevent the concrete from ever cooling and hardening properly. Worse, as the outer layers cooled and contracted while the inner mass remained hot and expanded, the resulting stresses threatened to tear the structure apart from within, a monument that might spend, not years but centuries, slowly cracking itself to pieces, its own chemistry acting as a silent adversary long after the last worker had gone home. This was not a hypothetical concern raised only by cautious skeptics. It was a genuine and largely unsolved engineering problem, and it drew open doubt from figures across the profession. Respected engineers, men whose careers had been built on the sound and sober application of established methods, questioned publicly whether a mass of concrete on this scale could ever properly cure at all. Some suggested that decades might pass before the interior of such a dam reached a stable temperature, and that in the meantime, the structure would remain vulnerable, its full strength forever deferred to some uncertain future date. Others wondered whether the design being contemplated was simply too large for concrete as a material, whether the very properties that made it useful at smaller scales made it treacherous at this one. The doubts were not born of timidity so much as of genuine uncertainty. The engineers raising them were not wrong to note that no one, anywhere, had built anything remotely like what was now being proposed, and that the mathematics of heat and mass at this scale remained in significant respects unmapped territory. It fell to the Bureau's engineers to answer these doubts, not with reassurance, but with method. And it was in searching for that method that the design itself began to take its final and defining shape. Early proposals had considered a straight gravity dam, a design in which the sheer mass and weight of the concrete alone would hold back the river's pressure, relying on nothing but its own bulk pressed down against the bedrock below. Such a design was well understood and comparatively simple to calculate, but it demanded an enormous quantity of material, more than even the ambitious federal budgets of the era could easily accommodate, and its very straightforwardness offered nothing to address the deeper anxiety about internal heat building unchecked within so vast and uniform a mass. The alternative, and the design that would eventually be adopted, borrowed instead from an older architectural principle, one that predated concrete by many centuries and had first proven itself in the curved stone bridges and vaulted ceilings of ancient builders who understood, long before anyone could explain it mathematically, that a curve pressed against solid ground could carry loads. No straight wall could manage alone. An arch, properly shaped, does not simply resist the forces pressing against it. It redirects them, channeling the push of water or weight outward along its curve and into whatever solid material holds its ends in place. Applied to a dam wedged between the narrow, close-set walls of a steep canyon, This principle suggested something remarkable, that the ancient rock of Black Canyon itself, walls of hardened volcanic stone that had stood undisturbed for millions of years, sharing the burden that concrete alone would otherwise have to bear entirely by its own weight. The design that emerged from this thinking combined both principles at once and would come to be known as an arch-gravity dam, a structure curved in plan like a great bow bent against the current, so that the river's pressure was carried not only downward into the bedrock beneath, but outward into the solid canyon walls to either side, while still retaining enough shear mass at its base to stand secure even without the arch's assistance. It was an elegant answer to a difficult problem, reducing the total volume of concrete required while distributing the immense pressures of the reservoir across more surfaces than a gravity dam alone could employ. But elegance on paper was not yet proof against doubt in practice, and it would fall to the men who actually built the thing, rather than those who merely designed it, to answer the remaining and more practical question of how such a design might be executed at all. How concrete could be placed, block by careful block, in a manner that avoided the very heat trap the whole design was meant to sidestep. It was into this uncertain moment that a construction consortium calling itself 6 companies stepped forward to accept the government's contract, and it was from within that consortium that Frank Crowe emerged as the man who would oversee the dam's actual rise from the canyon floor. Crowe was, by the standards of his profession, already something of a legend among those who worked in heavy construction, a superintendent known across a string of earlier bureau projects for driving his crews harder and faster than seemed reasonable, and for delivering, again and again, results that matched or exceeded his own relentless timetables. He had spent years working smaller dam projects throughout the West, refining almost obsessively his own methods for moving concrete and men efficiently across difficult terrain, and it was said among those who had worked under him that Crowe thought of little else beyond the logistics of construction, the cableways, the mixing plants, the sequencing of pours, treating each project less as a singular achievement than as a problem in the movement of material at speed. 6 companies itself represented an unusual alliance, a consortium formed specifically because no single construction firm in the country possessed the resources or the confidence to accept a contract of this size alone. Several large Western construction outfits pooled their capital and their reputations together, aware that failure on a project this visible, undertaken under this much public and governmental scrutiny, could ruin every firm involved. Crowe, for his part, approached the contract with characteristic calm and characteristic hunger, treating the design's remaining uncertainties not as reasons for hesitation, but as problems yet to be solved through careful sequencing and relentless attention to schedule. He had waited years, by his own account, for a project worthy of his methods, and in the arch-gravity design taking shape on bureau drafting tables, he had found it. A structure large enough at last to demand everything he had spent his career learning how to give. Before a single block of concrete could be set into the canyon, before the arch-gravity design could rise from paper into stone and cement, the river itself had to be persuaded to go elsewhere. This was not a metaphor. The Colorado, in the stretch called Black Canyon, ran wide and brown and indifferent to the ambitions gathering on its banks, carrying with it each day a volume of water that varied by season but never by disposition. It moved because it had always moved, cutting through rock long before any surveyor had walked its rim. And it would go on moving whether or not men believed they could build across it. The engineers understood, in the plainest terms available to them, that no dam could be built in a live riverbed. The water had to be taken somewhere else, held there long enough for the canyon floor to be cleared, excavated and built upon, and only then returned to its channel once the structure could withstand its full return. This was the first great engineering problem of Hoover Dam, and in some respects the most delicate, because it required not the raising of something new, but the temporary undoing of something ancient, a river's path, coaxed for a handful of years into tunnels blasted through solid rock. 4 diversion tunnels were planned, 2 on each canyon wall, each one nearly 60 feet in diameter, driven through rock that had never before felt a drill bit or a stick of dynamite. The scale of this excavation alone would have qualified as a major undertaking in any other era. Here it was merely the preliminary condition for beginning the true work. Crews advanced from both ends of each tunnel alignment, working toward each other through the dark, guided by survey lines that had to be maintained with obsessive precision across hundreds of feet of blind rock, because a tunnel that wandered even slightly off its intended course would fail to meet its counterpart, and the consequences of such an error, discovered only after months of drilling, were too costly to contemplate. The rock of Black Canyon was volcanic in origin, hard and unpredictable, alternating between sections that yielded to the drills with something like cooperation, and sections that resisted every method thrown against them, cracking unevenly, shifting weight onto timber supports that groaned audibly in the enclosed dark. Men worked in shifts around the clock, the tunnels lit by strings of electric bulbs that threw more shadow than illumination, the air thick with the exhaust of gasoline-powered equipment before proper ventilation systems could be installed to clear it. Carbon monoxide built in pockets along the tunnel walls, invisible and without smell, strong enough to warn a tired man in time. And in the tunnel's early months, this proved to be one of the labor's quieter dangers, not the dramatic collapse or the sudden rockfall that made for grim headlines, but a slow poisoning of the air that a worker might not notice until his hands would no longer answer him properly. The drilling itself followed a rhythm that repeated itself thousands of times across the length of each tunnel. Crews would advance the rock face with pneumatic drills mounted on a mobile rig nicknamed, with the plain humor common to hard labor, the jumbo, a multi-armed steel frame that allowed a dozen or more drills to bore into the rock face simultaneously, each hole packed afterward with dynamite, the crew withdrawn to a safe distance, the charge fired, and the rubble that resulted mucked out by hand and machine before the jumbo could be wheeled back in and the cycle begun again. Each cycle advanced the tunnel by only a matter of feet. Measured against the total length required, several thousand feet for each of the 4 bores, the pace could feel to men laboring inside it almost imperceptibly slow, a kind of geological patience imposed upon human muscle and human schedule alike. And yet the tunnels did advance, foot by foot, blast by blast, through months that ran from the cool of early winter into the punishing heat of a canyon summer, the rock face receding steadily into the mountain, until, at last, the crews, boring from opposite ends of each alignment, broke through into each other's excavations. The tunnels joined into continuous passages capable of carrying the river's full volume around the construction site. But boring, the tunnels solved only part of the problem. A tunnel is only useful if the water can be persuaded to enter it, and persuading a river to leave its bed required structures built directly in the river's path. The cofferdams, temporary barriers of rock and earth, and later of concrete, built upstream and downstream of the main construction site to hold back the water and direct its flow into the newly finished diversion tunnels. The upstream cofferdam in particular represented an engineering challenge nearly as demanding as the tunnels themselves, for it had to withstand the pressure of a river in its natural state, a river that could rise without warning. Swelling with a violence the canyon's builders had no power to predict, and only limited power to prepare against. Records from the period describe moments when the river rose faster than the cofferdam's construction could account for, when crews worked through the night, reinforcing the barrier against water that seemed determined to reclaim ground already surrendered. The danger here was not abstract. A cofferdam breached meant a construction site flooded equipment lost, men caught in a canyon with rising water and limited routes to high ground. The river had cut this canyon over millions of years and showed no particular deference to a construction schedule measured in months. Once the coffer dams held and the tunnels carried the diverted flow, the canyon floor beneath the old riverbed lay exposed for the first time in the memory of any living person. And it was not, as it turned out, a clean surface waiting to receive a foundation. It was buried under accumulated silt, gravel, and debris, deposited by the river across untold centuries, layers of material that had to be stripped away entirely before anyone could determine what lay beneath, or whether what lay beneath was suitable to carry the weight of the dam at all. This excavation work was its own form of hard labor, distinct from the tunnel boring but no less demanding. Crews working in the exposed riverbed, with the cofferdams holding back a river that never entirely stopped seeping through gaps and joints, requiring constant pumping to keep the excavation dry enough to work in. The silt clung to everything, to boots, to equipment, to the wheels of the trucks hauling debris away, and the work of clearing it was unglamorous, repetitive, and essential, because beneath that silt lay the answer to the question that mattered more than any other in these early months: was the rock strong enough? The dam's designers had specified that its foundation must rest on sound bedrock rock, capable of bearing not only the dam's static weight, but the tremendous lateral pressure the reservoir would eventually exert against it once the lake began to fill behind the completed structure. This was the deeper logic behind the arch-gravity design, taking shape on bureau drafting tables, a design that transferred much of its load sideways into the canyon walls, rather than relying purely on its own mass to resist the water's push. And such a design demanded canyon walls and a canyon floor capable of accepting that transferred load without shifting, without cracking, without slowly failing across the decades the dam was meant to stand. Testing this was neither simple nor quick. Engineers and geologists examined the exposed rock inch by inch, probing for fractures, for weak seams, for any sign that the volcanic rock of Black Canyon might harbor hidden weaknesses beneath its solid appearance. Where the rock proved unsound, where fractures ran too deep, or where the material crumbled under testing pressure that true bedrock should have withstood without complaint, it was blasted away and removed, regardless of how much additional excavation this required, because a foundation resting on compromised rock, Dharma near a delayed collapse, waiting for the reservoir's full weight to expose it. This process of testing, condemning, and removing unsuitable rock extended the excavation far beyond what the original schedule had allowed. Canyon walls carved back in-stepped terraced cuts that gave the site, for a time, the appearance less of a construction project and more of an open quarry. Men and machines, working across a landscape, reshaped daily by blast and removal. The patience this required cannot be overstated, though it rarely appears in the more dramatic retellings of the dam's construction. There was no glory in confirming that a section of rock was sound, no headline in a geologist's report that the bedrock beneath a given quadrant of the canyon floor met the required standard. And yet this slow, unglamorous verification, carried out beside a river that had been diverted but never tamed, in a canyon whose heat had already begun to test the limits of the men working within it, above tunnels still carrying the Colorado's full volume around the construction site, represented the true foundation of everything that would follow. No arch could rise, no block of concrete could be poured, till the ground beneath had proven itself equal to the weight about to be asked of it. The river had been pushed aside, the canyon floor had been laid bare. Now the canyon itself would have to prove it was strong enough to hold what men intended to build upon it. But proving the ground was only the first of many quiet proofs the canyon would demand. Long before the first bucket of concrete could be lowered into the forms that waited in Black Canyon, Another labor had already begun some miles away, in the low hills and riverbed terraces where the desert itself would be asked to yield the raw substance of the dam. A structure of this size was not built from stone quarried and dressed by hand, in the manner of the old cathedrals and fortresses that had stood for centuries before it. It was built from aggregate, sand and gravel and crushed rock, bound together by cement and water into a material that could be poured and settled and left to harden into something as enduring as anything cut whole from a mountainside. An aggregate of the quantity this project required could not simply be found. It had to be searched for, tested, and claimed, mile by mile, from deposits that had waited in the desert since long before anyone imagined a dam might one day stand in the canyon nearby. The engineers found what they needed several miles upstream and across the river, in a wide gravel deposit near what would come to be called Government Wash, and in the sands that had gathered along old river terraces, where the Colorado, over the slow accumulation of centuries, had left behind exactly the mixture of stone sizes that concrete required. It was, in its way, a strange gift from the same river the dam was built to contain. The very deposits the Colorado had carried and abandoned across thousands of years of flooding and retreat now offered themselves as the material with which men would attempt to hold that same river in place. Test pits were dug, samples were hauled to laboratories and examined for strength, for gradation, for the proportion of sand to gravel to larger stone that would give the finished concrete its necessary density. Nothing was assumed. Every deposit under consideration was measured against the exacting standards the dam's designers had set for a failure of aggregate, discovered only after the concrete had cured, would have been a failure with no remedy. Once the deposits were confirmed, the work of extraction began at a scale the region had never before seen. Draglines and shovels bit into the terraces, drawing out sand and gravel in quantities that would eventually total in the millions of cubic yards. The material was carried by conveyor and by rail to processing plants built specifically for this purpose. Plants where the raw aggregate was washed, sorted by size, and screened into the precise proportions the mix design called for. Nothing about this process was incidental. Concrete, unlike stone, could not be inspected after the fact and rejected if it proved unsound. Its strength had to be built in from the very first stage of sorting sand from gravel, long before cement or water ever touched it. The processing plants ran continuously, their machinery grinding through the desert heat day and night, producing streams of graded aggregate that were then loaded onto rail cars and moved toward the canyon. The cement itself came from a different labor altogether, though one no less vast in its ambition. No cement plant of sufficient capacity existed anywhere near the site when the project began, and so plants were built for the singular purpose of supplying this one structure. 6 manufacturers combined their capacity under contract to the project, some constructing new facilities, others expanding existing works, all coordinated to deliver a flow of cement precise enough that construction would never be forced to pause for want of material, yet controlled enough that no more was produced than the work could use in its allotted time. Tech. It was an arrangement without precedent in its scale. Cement production organized not around a market of many buyers, but around the singular, calculated appetite of one canyon and the structure rising within it. The cement arrived by rail in the way that nearly everything essential to the project arrived. For the railway itself had been one of the earliest labors undertaken long before concrete had ever been discussed in earnest. A spur line had been built out from the main railroad at Las Vegas, stretching some 20 miles across the desert to reach the rim of the canyon, and from there, additional spurs descended toward the construction site itself, threading down grades steep enough that engineers had debated in the earliest planning. Whether rail could reach the canyon floor at all, it could and did, though the descent required careful grading and repeated switchbacks to bring the loaded cars down safely into Black Canyon. Without this rail line, the project could not have proceeded at anything resembling the pace required. Cement, steel, machinery, lumber, and the thousands of tons of aggregate all depended on this single-threaded connection between the desert's edge and the river below. And its construction, though rarely remembered with the same reverence as the dam itself, represented an engineering achievement in its own right, a passage carved into terrain that had never before carried anything heavier than a wagon track. Why concrete, and why in such quantity, was a question the engineers had answered long before the first railway spur was surveyed. No other material available to them in this era could have met the demands the dam would place upon it. Steel alone, however strong, could not economically be shaped into a mass sufficient to resist the pressure of a reservoir this size. Timber and masonry, the materials of dams built in earlier decades, lacked both the strength and the durability required for a structure meant to stand not for years, but for centuries. Concrete offered something none of these materials could match: the ability to be poured into nearly any shape the design required, to bond seamlessly with adjoining pores when handled correctly, and to gain strength steadily over years, rather than weakening, allowing a mass of astonishing weight to behave in effect, as a single continuous stone shaped precisely to the canyon's needs. It was, in the truest sense, an artificial rock, assembled rather than quarried, but no less solid for having been made rather than found. The scale of concrete this ambition required had never before been attempted in a single structure. When completed, the dam would contain enough concrete to pave a highway stretching from San Francisco to New York, a comparison the engineers themselves were fond of offering to a public that had difficulty otherwise grasping a number so large it ceased to feel like a measurement of anything real. Producing, delivering, and placing a volume of material on this scale required not only new methods of construction, which would be developed as the work proceeded, but an entirely new logistical apparatus simply to keep the aggregate, cement, and water arriving in the correct proportions. It was a task that reshaped, in a quiet but permanent way, how engineers of the era understood what concrete construction could achieve, proving that a material once reserved for foundations, retaining walls, and modest structures could, if organized with sufficient discipline, be raised into something as vast and enduring as the canyon walls that would contain it. None of this labor, the quarrying, the processing, the cement production, the endless procession of loaded rail cars, could have proceeded without somewhere for the people performing it to live. And so, even as the aggregate deposits were being tested and the rail spurs graded, another kind of construction was underway a few miles from the canyon rim, the building of an entire town from nothing for the sole purpose of housing the thousands who would come to do this work. Boulder City was not an existing settlement pressed into service, nor a temporary camp thrown up and later abandoned, but a planned community laid out with deliberate care by government architects who intended it to bring order and stability to a workforce that might otherwise have been left to fend for itself in the desert. Streets were surveyed before a single worker arrived. Utilities were planned before the first house was framed. It was, in its quiet way, as considered a piece of construction as the dam itself, though built for a different purpose, not to hold back a river, but to hold together the lives of the people who would spend years holding back that river on the government's behalf. By the time the aggregate plants were running at full capacity and the cement trains were making their steady descent into the canyon, Boulder City had begun to take shape as well, a scattering of government buildings, mess halls, and modest houses rising from ground that had held nothing but creosote and rock only months before. It would grow in time into a town of several thousand residents, home to engineers and laborers alike, and it would remain standing long after the dam it was built to support had been completed, a quieter monument to the same ambition that had gathered stone from the riverbed, cement from 6 manufacturers, and organized all of it toward a single, unwavering purpose in the depths of Black Canyon. For the men who came to Black Canyon in those first months, life arranged itself around a heat that seemed to belong to no ordinary season. The desert around the Colorado River did not simply grow warm in the daylight hours. It became, by midsummer, a place where the air itself seemed to press down with a physical weight, where temperatures at the bottom of the canyon reached 120 degrees or more, trapped and thickened by the rock walls that rose on either side. The workers who descended each morning into that heat carried with them the knowledge, spoken and unspoken, that the canyon would take a toll before a single yard of concrete had been poured. The dam itself had not yet begun to rise, and already the ground demanded its price in exhaustion, in dizziness, in the slow creeping danger of bodies pushed past what they could bear. The wages that drew men to this work were, by the standards of the era, considerable enough to justify the risk, though never so considerable as to erase the hardship. A common laborer might earn $4 for a day's work, a figure that could support a family in a country where so many families had nothing at all. Skilled tradesmen, the carpenters, the electricians, the men who understood machinery and steel, earned more, sometimes considerably more, and the wage scale became its own quiet hierarchy within the canyon, visible in the way men spoke to one another, in the small deferences shown to those whose skills could not easily be replaced. But even the highest wages could not soften the length of the shifts or the punishing rhythm of the work itself. Crews rotated through the day and night in staggered patterns, for the dam's construction did not pause when the sun went down. It could not pause, given the scale of what remained to be done and the urgency that had carried men here in the first place. Floodlights burned through the canyon dark, and the work continued beneath them, shift following shift in an unbroken chain that mirrored the river's own refusal to rest. The heat did not relent with the sunset, not entirely. Stone holds warmth long after the sky has darkened, and the canyon walls release their accumulated heat slowly through the night hours, so that even the night shifts labored in conditions that would have been considered dangerous almost anywhere else. Men reported for work, knowing that the day ahead, or the night ahead, would test them in ways that had little to do with the technical demands of the job and everything to do with simple endurance, the ability to keep moving, keep lifting, keep climbing, when the body's instinct was to slow, to rest, to seek shade that did not exist. Records from those early months describe a toll that grew before it was fully understood. Heat exhaustion struck workers with a suddenness that could not always be predicted, men collapsing where they stood, their bodies unable to shed the heat fast enough despite whatever caution had been exercised. The company that oversaw construction eventually introduced measures meant to reduce the danger. Salt tablets distributed to replace what sweat carried away. Water stations placed along the routes where men worked. Adjustments to shift timing. These measures helped, though they could not eliminate the risk entirely, and the historical record shows that heat remained one of the persistent dangers of the project throughout its early years, a hazard as real in its way as the falls and structural accidents that would claim lives as the work progressed. Housing for the workers took shape gradually, and in the earliest months, before Boulder City had grown into anything resembling a proper town, many men lived in makeshift camps closer to the canyon itself, in structures that offered little protection from the heat that had already proven so dangerous. Some slept during the day in tents or crude shelters where the temperature inside could climb even higher than the air outside. The canvas and thin wood doing little to block the sun's force. It was, by every account that survives, an exhausting way to live, even when a man was not working, the body finding no true rest, even in the hours meant for sleep. As Boulder City took clearer shape, its streets laid out, its houses built with government oversight, its mess halls and stores beginning to serve a growing population, conditions improved, and the town came to offer something closer to ordinary life amid the extraordinary demands of the work nearby. Families arrived to join the men who could afford to bring them, and for a time, the settlement took on the rhythms of any small American town, however briefly, however strangely juxtaposed against the vast engineering effort taking place just a few miles distant in the canyon itself. Meals were simple, but, by the accounts of many workers, substantial: meat, bread, vegetables served in quantities meant to sustain men through shifts that demanded enormous physical output. The mess halls became gathering points not only for food, but for the brief camaraderie that punctuated days otherwise defined by labor and heat. Men spoke of these meals later, in interviews and recollections gathered by historians, with a particular fondness that seemed to have less to do with the food itself than with what it represented. A shared pause, a moment of common experience among men who had come from vastly different corners of the country, drawn by the same need for work and the same willingness to risk the canyon's dangers in exchange for wages that might carry a family through hard times. This camaraderie extended beyond the mess halls. Men who worked together, who faced the same heat and the same risks, developed the kind of loyalty that dangerous work tends to produce, a recognition that survival depended in part on watching out for the crew beside you, on calling out a warning when a rock shifted overhead or a scaffold seemed unsteady. Photographs and written accounts from the period show groups of workers posed together during rare moments of rest, their faces marked by sun and dust, their postures suggesting an ease that came from shared hardship rather than from any absence of exhaustion. It was, by every measure, a hard life, but it was not a life without its human textures, its small comforts, its moments of genuine connection between men who might otherwise have had little in common beyond the accident of having arrived in the same desert canyon at the same moment in history. The dangers of the work went beyond heat alone, though heat remained ever present in the background of every task. The canyon walls themselves posed a constant hazard, for the rock was not uniform, not stable in every place, and loose stone could shift or fall with little warning, threatening the men working below on the cofferdams, the diversion tunnels, and eventually the dam's foundation itself. Falls were a recognized risk from the earliest planning stages, given the sheer scale of the canyon walls and the exposed nature of much of the work, conducted often on scaffolding or rope far above the riverbed. The historical record acknowledges that fatalities occurred throughout the construction period, and while exact figures have been debated by historians in the years since, the danger itself was never in question among the men who worked there, nor among the engineers who oversaw them. It was in addressing this particular danger, the danger of loose and unstable rock along the canyon walls, that one of the most distinctive and often remembered elements of the entire project emerged: the high scalers. These were the men tasked with descending the canyon walls on ropes, suspended high above the riverbed, armed with jackhammers, crowbars, and dynamite, sent to clear away loose stone before it could fall unpredictably onto the crews working below. The work demanded a particular combination of physical strength, careful judgment, and a tolerance for exposure that few other tasks on the project required. Dangling from ropes anchored at the canyon's rim, the high scalers swung across the rock face, searching out loose sections, prying them free or blasting them away, working at heights that offered no margin for error and little protection beyond their own skill and the strength of the ropes that held them. Accounts from the period described the high scalers with a particular kind of respect, even something approaching local legend, for the way they moved across the canyon walls with what appeared to be effortless confidence, though the work itself was neither effortless nor without its own considerable dangers. They fashioned makeshift hard hats from cloth and resin, an improvised solution to the danger of falling debris that would later influence the design of protective headgear more broadly. Their labor, suspended between sky and river, became one of the enduring images associated with the dam's construction, a testament to human skill and daring set against the raw scale of the canyon itself. Whatever the precise numbers of men who performed this work, and whatever variations exist in the surviving accounts of their methods and routines, the high scalers occupy a particular place in the memory of Black Canyon's construction. Men who worked not against the river, but against the stone itself, clearing the way for what would follow quietly, carefully high above the water that had not yet been tamed. Before the first block of concrete could be set into place, before the great weight of the dam could begin its slow accumulation against the river, the engineers of the Bureau of Reclamation faced a problem that had nothing to do with rock or scaling or the arrangement of cofferdams against the current. It was a problem of chemistry and thermodynamics, quiet and unspectacular in its nature, and yet it threatened, in its own patient way, to undo the entire structure before it had a chance to stand. Concrete, as it cures, generates heat. This is a simple fact of the material, understood by masons and builders for generations, and in an ordinary structure, a bridge pier, a building foundation, a modest wall, this heat dissipates into the surrounding air and ground quickly enough that it poses no threat to the integrity of the work. But Hoover Dam was not an ordinary structure. It was to be, when finished, a solid mass of concrete unlike anything attempted before it, containing enough material to pave a highway from San Francisco to New York, and set within a single continuous pour, or anything resembling one. That mass would hold its heat as a stone holds warmth long after the sun has set. Only immeasurably longer and immeasurably more consequential. The engineers calculated in the manner of engineers before they built. And what the calculations showed, according to the studies conducted in the design phase, was this: if the dam were poured as a single monolithic mass, the concrete at its core would take, by some estimates, over a century to cool to the ambient temperature of the surrounding rock. A century. The men doing this work would not live to see the concrete at the center of their dam reach a stable temperature. Their children might not live to see it. And during all that long century of cooling, as the outer surfaces of the concrete released their heat into the desert air, while the inner mass remained warm and expanding, the resulting stresses between hot interior and cool exterior would tear the structure apart from within. The concrete would crack, not in one dramatic failure, but in the slow, patient way that heat differential always cracks. Material, a fissure here, a fracture line there, spreading through the mass over years and decades, until a dam that was meant to hold back a river could no longer be trusted to hold back anything at all. This was, by any reasonable accounting, an unacceptable outcome for a structure whose entire purpose was to stand without interruption for generations. The solution that emerged from this problem was not a solution of brute force, though brute force had characterized much of the work in the canyon up to this point. The clearing of the diversion tunnels, the removal of loose rock from the canyon walls, the sheer. Instead, the answer to the cooling problem was a solution of design, of pattern, of geometry applied with patience rather than muscle. The engineers determined that the dam would not be poured as one continuous mass at all. It would instead be built as a mosaic, an interlocking arrangement of individual blocks, each one roughly rectangular in plan, ranging in size from perhaps 60 feet square in the base sections to smaller dimensions higher up the structure, and each one poured separately, in stages, allowed to cure and release its heat before more concrete was added around it or upon it. Some accounts describe the total number of these blocks as approaching, by certain reckonings, several thousand across the full extent of the dam's construction, though the sources vary somewhat in how they count and categorize the individual pours. And the precise figure remains a matter of some disagreement among those who have studied the project's records. What is not disputed is the underlying principle. Rather than fight the concrete's natural tendency to hold heat, the engineers worked with it, breaking the mass into pieces small enough that each one could release its heat within a manageable span of time, weeks rather than centuries, and only then be joined to its neighbors to form the continuous tenaries. Solid structure the dam required. This arrangement of blocks gave the dam, in its early stages of construction, an appearance unlike anything the workers or visitors to the site had seen before. Photographs from the period show the canyon floor and the rising structure divided into a vast checkerboard, individual columns of concrete standing at slightly different heights, depending on when each had been poured, some sections gleaming with the pale grey of fresh concrete, while others poured weeks or months earlier had already taken on the slightly weathered look of cured material exposed to the desert sun. Wooden forms defined the edges of each block, built and rebuilt by carpenters who worked in close coordination with the concrete crews, and between the blocks ran narrow gaps, deliberately left open, that would later need to be filled and sealed once the individual sections had cooled sufficiently to be joined without introducing the very cracking the block system was designed to prevent. But the blocks alone, dividing the mass into manageable pieces, addressed only part of the cooling problem. Even a block 60 feet square and 5 feet deep, the dimensions commonly used for many of the interior pours, still represented enough concrete to generate significant heat during curing, and left entirely to itself, even this reduced mass would take weeks or months to cool naturally to a stable temperature, time that, multiplied across thousands of blocks poured in careful sequence, would have stretched the construction schedule into decades rather than years. The engineers needed a way to actively draw the heat out of each block, to hurry along a process that nature, left alone, would perform far too slowly. Their answer to this second problem was as elegant in its own mechanical way as the block system had been in its geometric one. Embedded within each block of concrete, laid in place by workers before the pour began, was a network of thin steel pipes arranged in a coiled or serpentine pattern that wound through the interior of the block, much as a radiator winds through the space it is meant to warm. Only here the purpose was reversed. These pipes existed to cool, not to heat. Through this embedded network, water was circulated continuously, drawn first from the river itself, in the earlier phases of construction, and later, as the engineers refined their understanding of the cooling requirements, from a dedicated refrigeration plant, built specifically to chill water to a lower temperature than the river could provide. This cooled water, pumped through the coiled pipes at a steady rate, absorbed the heat generated by the curing concrete and carried it away, out of the block and out of the structure entirely, allowing each section to reach a stable, manageable temperature, not in decades, but in a matter of days or weeks. According to the records kept by the project's engineers, the scale of this cooling system, considered in isolation from the dam itself, was remarkable. According to the figures preserved in Bureau of Reclamation records, the total length of pipe embedded within the concrete of Hoover Dam ran to several hundred miles, threading through block after block in a pattern that, had it been laid end to end rather than distributed through the structure, would have stretched across a significant portion of the American West. Once a given block had cooled sufficiently and the pipes within it had completed their purpose, the pipes themselves were not removed, Doing so would have been impractical, given that they were permanently embedded in solid concrete, but were instead filled with grout, sealing them in place, becoming a permanent, silent part of the dam's interior structure, no longer carrying water, but remaining as a kind of buried record of the process that had made the concrete safe to build upon and around. There is a particular quality to this solution that rewards quiet reflection. The problem the engineers faced was not one that could be solved by additional labor, by more men working longer hours, by greater strength applied against stubborn material. It was a problem of time and temperature, and the men who solved it did so not by working harder against the concrete, but by thinking more carefully about it, by breaking a seemingly indivisible task into smaller pieces, and by introducing into the heart of the material itself a mechanism patient enough to draw away what needed to be drawn away, at a pace the material could tolerate. It is worth noting too that this solution required a kind of trust in invisible processes, in pipes buried within concrete that no one could see once the pour was complete, in the assumption that water circulating unseen through hundreds of miles of embedded steel was doing the quiet work of preventing a catastrophe that would otherwise unfold slowly. Over generations, long after the engineers who designed the system had passed from memory, this was not a triumph announced with the drama of a diversion tunnel closing off a river or a scaler dangling from a rope against a canyon wall. It was a triumph of foresight worked out on paper and in laboratories before a single block was poured, and it stands in its own understated way as one of the quieter achievements embedded, literally and figuratively, within the mass of Hoover Dam, a solution that asked not for force, but for patience, and for a kind of engineering imagination capable of solving a problem that would not announce itself as a problem until it was already far too late to correct. With the cooling system resolved and the interlocking pattern of blocks fixed in the drawings, the work of raising the dam could begin in earnest. And what followed was not a single continuous pour, but a slow, patient accumulation, block by block, bucket by bucket, carried out with a rhythm that had almost nothing in common with the frantic pace one might imagine from a project of this scale. The concrete did not arrive at the canyon floor in a great rushing river of its own. It came down in measured portions, 8 cubic yards at a time, carried in steel buckets suspended from an intricate system of cableways strung high above the canyon, and it was in the movement of these buckets, more than in any other single image, that the daily labor of building Hoover Dam found its visible rhythm. The cableway system itself was a work of engineering discipline in its own right, 5 separate cables strung across the canyon at different heights and angles, each mounted on towers anchored into the canyon walls, to die-end capable of carrying a loaded bucket from the mixing plants above the site down to any point along the dam's footprint with a precision that had to be measured in inches rather than feet. A bucket once filled at the mixing plant would be hooked to a cable, and an operator working from a control station would guide its descent, swinging it out over the void of the canyon and lowering it toward whichever block was ready to receive its next lift. The operators became, over months of practice, extraordinarily skilled at this work, capable of placing a bucket's load within a narrow target with a kind of unconscious precision that came only from repetition, from thousands of such placements performed under the same canyon light, in the same rising heat, day after day. Each block, once a bucket arrived above it, received its concrete not as a single mass poured all at once, but in careful layers spread and worked by crews standing inside the wooden forms that gave each block its shape. The forms themselves were substantial structures built of heavy timber, braced and reinforced to withstand the pressure of the concrete they would contain, and they had to be assembled with their own exacting tolerances, for any gap or misalignment in a form could produce a flaw in the finished block that no amount of later correction could fully erase. Carpenters worked ahead of the pouring crews, framing the next block's forms while concrete still cured in the block before it. so that the whole operation moved forward not as a single front, but as a series of overlapping stages, each crew engaged in a different phase of a process that never entirely paused. Once the concrete arrived within a form, it did not simply settle into place under its own weight. Workers using vibrating equipment moved through the freshly placed material, easing out the air pockets and voids that would otherwise weaken the block, working the mixture until it settled into a dense, uniform mass, free of the honeycombing that inferior placement could produce. This vibration work required its own kind of attention, for concrete work too little would leave weaknesses hidden inside the block, while concrete work too long risked separating its components, and so the crews developed, through trial and through the quiet correction of engineers observing the results, a feel for how long was enough. A judgment that became, like so much else on the project, a kind of embodied knowledge passed from more experienced hands to newer ones. Each block rose in this manner, layer upon layer, cooling pipe upon cooling pipe, until it reached the height at which the next lift could begin, and it was this lift height, 5 feet at a time, that gave the entire construction its particular tempo. A block would receive its 5 feet of concrete, and then work on that block would pause, sometimes for as long as 3 or 4 days, while the embedded cooling pipes did their work and the concrete released the heat generated by its own curing. Only once the block had cooled sufficiently would the crews return to add the next 5-foot lift atop it, and this meant that at any given moment the dam's rising face was not a single uniform surface climbing steadily upward, but a patchwork of blocks at different stages, some freshly poured and still warm, some cooling under their embedded pipes. Champsom finished with their lift and waiting for the next, so that the whole structure advanced not like a wall being built brick by brick in a simple ascending line, but like some vast three-dimensional puzzle assembling itself unevenly, block by block, each piece moving forward according to its own schedule of curing and cooling before it could rise further. This unevenness, chosen deliberately rather than tolerated as an unavoidable inconvenience, meant that the pace of the dam's construction, when measured over the whole of a season, moved with a steadiness that no daily glance at the site could have suggested. Watching from the canyon rim on any single afternoon, an observer might have seen relatively little visible change, a bucket descending here, a form being stripped there, a crew vibrating fresh concrete in a block on the far side of the site. But watching across the turn of a season, across the arrival of one crew's replacement by the next, across the slow procession of the seasons themselves, the change became unmistakable, the dam's face climbing steadily higher against the canyon walls. The individual blocks gradually losing their separate identity within the larger mass as more and more of the structure filled in around them. The machinery that supported this work extended well beyond the cableways and the mixing plants. Compressors drove pneumatic tools used in finishing and in drilling the connections between blocks. Pumps moved water for curing and for the endless needs of a work site that consumed water at a rate matched by few other operations of its era. Cranes and hoists moved materials and equipment along the canyon floor and up the rising faces of the dam, and a small railway system carried supplies between the different areas of the site, so that the canyon, in its working months, came to resemble not a single monolithic construction project, but an entire, small, industrial district, compressed into a narrow gorge, every piece of machinery timed and coordinated with every other, so that the flow of material never stalled and never overwhelmed the crews waiting to receive it. At every joint between blocks, at every interface where one day's work met the work that had come before it, the tolerances demanded were exacting. The keys and grooves cut into each block's sides, meant to interlock with their neighbors once the whole mass had cooled and the joints could be filled and sealed, had to align with a precision that left little room for the kind of accumulated small errors that might on a lesser project. simply have been absorbed into the finished structure without consequence. Surveyors checked and rechecked the position of forms before each pour, verifying that the dam's rising faces matched the design drawings not approximately, but closely, for any drift accumulated across hundreds of blocks could, by the time the dam reached its full height, have produced a structure meaningfully different from the one the engineers had calculated to withstand the pressures of the lake it was meant to hold back. And so the canyon itself began, through the accumulation of this careful, unhurried labor, to change in ways that became visible to anyone who returned to the site after even a short absence. Where once there had been only bare rock walls rising from the riverbed, a mass of pale concrete now climbed steadily upward, its surface marked by the faint seams between blocks, its progress uneven in detail, but unmistakable in aggregate. Workers who had been present since the earliest days of clearing the canyon floor spoke, in the accounts that survive, of a peculiar sensation in watching the dam rise around them, the sense of a canyon they had known as an open, empty space, gradually filling in the walls that had once framed only rock and river, now framing something built. Something that had not existed the season before, and that season by season drew nearer to filling the gorge entirely. By the time a given block had cooled, been grouted, and taken its place as simply one more anonymous portion of the finished mass, the crews had generally already moved on to lifts far above it, so that the lower reaches of the dam, once so alive with forms and cables, and the constant descent of buckets, grew quiet even as the work continued above. A slow retreat of activity toward the rising crest that mirrored in its own way the dam's gradual assumption of its final form. The canyon that had once seemed too vast and too resistant to be tamed by any human effort now held, rising from its floor, a structure whose outline was no longer a proposal on paper or a set of calculations in an engineer's notebook, but a visible, solid presence, climbing block by block toward the height it had been designed, long before, to reach. What remained, by the time the canyon had grown quiet in this way, was not the visible ascent of concrete against the sky, but the invisible work still proceeding within the mass itself, a process as essential to the dam's completion as the pouring of any single block had been, and one that received from those who understood it a degree of attention equal to anything that had come before. Each of the several hundred blocks that made up the dam's cross-section had been left, since its pouring, threaded with the same network of thin steel pipes that had carried river water and then refrigerated brine through the curing concrete, drawing the heat of hydration away so that the mass could cool without cracking, without tearing itself apart under the strain of its own chemistry. That cooling had proceeded block by block, column by column over months, and in some of the earliest sections over more than a year, monitored by thermocouples embedded in the concrete and read by engineers who tracked the falling temperatures on charts as carefully as a physician might track the recovery of a patient. And when a given block had cooled to within a few degrees of the temperature, it would hold on average through the seasons to come, once buried under the mass of neighboring blocks and shielded from the canyon sun. The pipes within it had done their work and were no longer needed for the purpose that had brought them into being. But the pipes could not simply be abandoned. Left empty, they would have remained as voids within the concrete thin channels of weakness running through a structure that depended, for its strength, on being not a collection of separate blocks loosely fitted together, but a single continuous mass, capable of transferring the river's thrust smoothly through its body. The vertical joints between blocks presented the same problem in a different form. Each block had been poured against its neighbors with keyways and grooves cut into the forming surfaces. Interlocking teeth of concrete meant to prevent one block from sliding against another, but between the faces there remained, even after the keys had been cast, a thin gap, unavoidable in the practice of pouring concrete in separate lifts and separate columns. And that gap, too, was a discontinuity in what needed, in the end, to behave as one material rather than many. Solution to both problems decided upon early and executed with the same discipline that had governed the pouring itself was grout, a thin, carefully proportioned mixture of cement and water, sometimes with sand, forced under pressure through the same pipe networks that had carried the cooling water, filling first the cooling pipes themselves, and then, through a separate and later system of grout pipes fitted into the vertical joints, filling the contraction joints between blocks until every gap, every channel, every thin plane of separation within the dam's mass had been sealed with solid material bonded to the concrete on either side. It was work that proceeded from the bottom of the dam upward and outward from the canyon walls toward the center, following a sequence dictated by the order in which blocks had cooled and by the engineering judgment of which sections could safely bear the load of neighboring still-warm concrete without distortion. Crews moved from gallery to gallery within the dam's interior, following the horizontal passages that had been left deliberately, running through the structure at various elevations, passages that allowed access to the grouting outlets, to the instruments monitoring temperature and movement. Over years, how the concrete continued to behave once it had taken its final form. The grouting of a single joint might occupy a crew for hours, working in the dim light of the interior galleries with the pump set up nearby and the pressure gauges watched carefully. Since too little pressure would leave voids ungrouted and too much risked disturbing the very joints the work was meant to seal. The material was mixed to a consistency thin enough to penetrate the narrow gaps and pipe networks, but thick enough not to simply run away into open cavities. And it was colored, in some records dark, with a slight tint that allowed inspectors to distinguish the grout from the surrounding concrete when cores were later taken to verify that the joints had filled completely. The work had none of the visible drama of the pours themselves, no towering buckets swinging on cables, no roar of falling concrete, no floodlights turning the canyon into a second day. It proceeded quietly, methodically, block by block and joint by joint, over a period that stretched across many months, running in parallel with the final pours still occurring at the dam's upper elevations, so that the completion of the structure was not a single afternoon, but a long, dead overlapping conclusion in which the top of the dam continued to rise even as its lower and middle sections were already being sealed into permanence. There came nonetheless a point, difficult to fix to a single day in most popular accounts, but recorded with more precision in the engineering logs, when the last of the principal contraction joints received its grout, when the final cooling pipe was filled and closed, and when the dam, considered purely as a mass of concrete, could be said to behave as one continuous structure rather than as the assembly of interlocking but separate blocks it had been throughout the years of pouring. The engineers who oversaw this final stage of grouting left, in their reports, none of the celebratory language that popular memory sometimes attaches to such moments. The tone of the surviving records is technical, careful, concerned, above all, with verification, with the pressure readings that confirmed a joint had truly filled, with the core samples that would later be drawn to check the bond between old concrete and new grout. And yet, within that flat procedural language, there is a discernible weight, a sense expressed occasionally in the private recollections of men who had spent years on the project, that this quiet, almost invisible work marked something more significant than any single pour or any single record broken. It was not a moment for photographs, since there was little to photograph beyond a crew and a pump in a dim gallery, and it did not draw the crowds that had once gathered to watch the first bucket of concrete descend into the canyon. But among the engineers who understood what the grouting represented, there was an unmistakable sense of arrival, a recognition that the dam, after years in which it had existed as a growing arrangement of separate, cooling, still settling masses, had finally become the single, unified body that its design had always required it to be. This transformation carried consequences beyond the merely structural. A dam built of unjoined blocks, however carefully interlocked, could not have been asked to hold back the full weight of a river the size of the Colorado, since the loads involved demanded a continuity of material through which stress could pass smoothly from one section to the next, distributing itself through the whole mass and down into the canyon walls and bedrock, rather than concentrating at the boundaries between separate blocks. The grouting was, in this sense, not a finishing touch applied after the real work was done, but a necessary and final structural act without which the concrete already poured, however vast in quantity, would have remained an assembly of parts rather than a dam capable of performing the function for which it had been designed. Only once the joints were sealed and the cooling pipes filled could the structure be considered, in the engineering sense, complete, ready in principle to accept the loads that would come with the rising of the water behind it. And it was this completeness, this quiet joining of block to block into a single mass, that marked the true transition in the project's long history, from a period defined by construction, by the pouring and cooling and shaping of concrete according to a design drawn years before. Patient work of holding back a river that had, for the whole of human memory before this, gone essentially unrestrained through this canyon. The reservoir gates had not yet been closed. The river still ran for a while longer through the diversion tunnels that had carried it around the construction site since the earliest years of the project. And the dam, though structurally whole, had not yet been asked to perform the task for which every block, every joint, ought. Every gallon of cooling water and every ton of grout had been prepared. But the joining of the blocks marked the moment after which that task became, for the first time, physically possible, the moment at which the canyon held, not a growing structure still finding its final form, but a finished dam, waiting in a stillness very different from the silence that had settled over its slopes, for the river to be turned against it. That waiting did not last long, and when the dam was finally allowed to stand before the eyes of engineers, workers, and the wider public as a completed structure rather than a work in progress, what they saw was a form so simple in its geometry and so vast in its execution that many of those who had spent years inside its blocks found themselves needing to relearn the shape of the thing they had built. Seen from the canyon rim, the dam did not rise so much as it appeared, a pale curve set into the dark rock as though it had always been there, waiting only for the water to reveal it. Seen from the river below, it was a different matter entirely, a wall climbing so far overhead that the eye lost track of its edges, the top disappearing into whatever haze the desert air offered that day. The concrete, still curing in its deep interior, wore on its surface the pale grey that would darken and weather over the coming decades, and the surface itself, where it had been finished smooth after the forms were stripped away, held a texture that was almost soft to the eye despite the hardness beneath it. The curve of the dam, arched gently upstream into the face of the river, was not a decorative flourish but a structural decision, one that allowed the mass of water pressing against the dam to be carried sideways into the canyon walls, rather than resting entirely on the base. Standing at the crest and looking along its length, a person could trace that curve with the eye, a long, deliberate bend that seemed almost gentle from a distance, and only revealed its true purpose when considered in terms of the load it was built to redirect. The top of the dam, where a road would eventually carry traffic across the canyon, ran level and wide enough for 2 lanes of vehicles to pass, bordered by low parapets that gave those crossing it an unbroken view down into the gorge on one side and out across the still-forming lake on the other. From that vantage, the scale of the thing became difficult to hold in the mind all at once. The dam's crest sat hundreds of feet above the riverbed it had replaced, and to look down from that height was to understand in a way no drawing could convey the volume of rock and water that the structure was meant to hold back. At the base, where the river had once run free through the gorge, the shape of the dam changed entirely. Here, the wall of concrete widened dramatically, the same section that had appeared slender near the top, thickening into a mass that, at its foundation, occupied nearly as much depth as the dam's total height. This widening was not visible from above in any dramatic way, since a person standing on the crest saw only the thin ribbon of roadway and the sheer drop beyond it. But for those who worked at the canyon floor, walking among the outlet pipes and along the corridors carved through the dam's interior, the sheer bulk of the base was impossible to escape. It was here, at this widest point, that the dam did its heaviest labor, resisting the combined pressure of the river above and the great weight of the concrete itself, a weight so enormous that the structure's own mass became one of its chief defenses against being pushed downstream. Rising from the canyon walls on either side of the dam, and set back slightly from its upstream face, stood the intake towers, 4 in total, 2 on each side of the river, their shapes rounded and almost architectural in a way that distinguished them from the plain grey mass of the dam proper. These towers were not part of the dam's structural wall, but stood as separate elements, connected to it by the water they would draw from the lake and by the tunnels running beneath the surrounding rock toward the power plant and the outlet works. Each tower was designed to draw water from different depths within the reservoir as the lake level changed over time, an arrangement that gave engineers control over which layer of water would be released depending on temperature, silt content, and the needs of the moment. Their tops, capped and finished with a restrained decorative style befitting the era in which they were built, rose above the eventual high water mark of the lake, so that even when the reservoir filled to its planned capacity, the towers would remain visible, marking the points where the river's water passed from open lake into controlled passage through the mountain. On the downstream side of the dam, the spillways completed the picture of a structure built not only to hold water back, but to manage its release under every circumstance the engineers could anticipate, including the circumstance in which the lake rose faster than the outlet works could handle. Cut into the canyon walls, above the dam itself, these spillways were designed to remain dry under normal conditions, silent channels waiting for a flood the dam's other systems could not otherwise absorb. Should the lake ever rise to the point where its waters threatened to overtop the dam, the spillways would carry the excess down through concrete-lined tunnels, past the dam structure entirely, and release it into the river below, a safety valve built into the landscape itself rather than into the dam's body. Their presence, quiet and unused in those early months, spoke to a philosophy of design that ran through every element of the project, an insistence that no single point of failure be allowed to threaten the whole, and that every extreme the river might one day offer be already accounted for in stone and concrete before it ever arrived. At the base of the dam, within the canyon's floor, and connected to it by the outlet works and penstocks running down from the intake towers, stood the powerhouse, a long, low structure, quite unlike the dam above it in both form and character. Where the dam was a single continuous mass, the powerhouse was built as a series of bays, U-shaped in plan, hugging the base of the dam on both the Nevada and Arizona sides of the river, its roofline low and its walls finished with the same restrained architectural touches that marked the intake towers, giving the whole complex a coherence of style despite the difference in function between its parts. Inside, in chambers built to precise tolerances and finished long before the first drop of water reached them, sat the generators, massive machines waiting in rows for the moment when the river, descending through the penstocks under the pressure of the reservoir above, would strike their turbines and begin turning them. Those generators, though built and installed with the same patience that had marked every other stage of the project, could do nothing without water, and water could not arrive until the lake had risen high enough and had been guided into the intake towers and down through the tunnels, bored specifically to feed them. In those first months after the dam's completion, The powerhouse stood as a finished shell around silent machines, every one of them capable of producing power the moment they were called upon, none of them yet doing so, waiting in the same stillness that had settled over the diversion tunnels once their work was done and the river no longer needed them. It was the closing of those diversion tunnels, in fact, that marked the true beginning of the dam's working life, more so than any ceremony held atop its crest or any inspection carried out along its length. For years, the river had been carried around the construction site through those tunnels, bypassing the growing structure entirely so that the canyon floor could remain dry enough for the work to proceed. Once the dam itself had risen high enough and grown solid enough to hold back the river on its own, the diversion tunnels were no longer needed for that purpose, and the decision was made to seal them, block by block, using the same interlocking method that had raised the dam itself. Until the passages that had carried the Colorado around the site for years were closed permanently, the river's old detour erased from the canyon's plumbing. With the tunnels closed, the river had nowhere left to go but into the space the dam now enclosed. And it was here, quietly and without any single dramatic instant, that observers could point to afterward, that Lake Mead began to rise. There was no flood, no sudden rush of water filling the canyon in a matter of hours. Instead, the river simply stopped being permitted to pass and began, day by day, to accumulate behind the wall that had been built to hold it, the water backing up first into the lowest reaches of the gorge, then climbing slowly against the canyon walls as weeks passed into months. Where once there had been a river moving through a dry desert landscape, there began to be a lake, its surface rising almost imperceptibly from one day to the next, but unmistakably, inexorably higher when compared across a season, the desert around it beginning, for the first time in the memory of anyone alive, to hold standing water instead of merely a channel through which water passed. It was, in its way, as quiet and unremarkable an event as the pouring of any single block of concrete had been, and yet it represented the entire purpose of the project, made visible at last, the river no longer running wild through the canyon, but rising into the shape the engineers had planned for it long before the first bucket of concrete had ever been poured. The gates that had once diverted the river through the tunnels bored around the construction site were closed in stages, deliberately and without ceremony, and the water that had for years been guided past the dam was now allowed to gather behind it. What had been a narrow channel of moving water cutting swiftly through the walls of Black Canyon, as it had for uncounted centuries, began instead to spread and settle, to find the contours of the land that had never before known the touch of anything but the rock itself and the sparse desert growth clinging to its slopes. The engineers who had calculated the volume of the reservoir on paper, who had walked the surveyed lines marking where the water would eventually reach, now watched those calculations become visible in a way that no drawing could have conveyed. Canyon walls that had stood dry for the whole of human memory found the water rising against them, inch by inch, and then foot by foot, submerging first the lower ledges where desert plants had taken root in the thin soil, then climbing higher still, erasing the boundary between what had been land and what had always, in some deeper sense, been meant to become lake. The filling was not swift. It could not be, for the river's flow, even at its most generous, could only raise so vast a body of water so quickly, and the engineers had planned for a process that would unfold across not weeks, but years. The sources do not agree on a single precise span for how long it took the reservoir to reach what would become its typical operating level, for the answer depended on the river's own irregular generosity from season to season, on years of heavier snowmelt in the mountains far to the north. But the accounts agree that the process stretched across several years rather than one, the water climbing gradually, sometimes almost imperceptibly, sometimes with the visible urgency of a spring flood, finally given somewhere to go rather than somewhere to rush past. Those who returned to the canyon during this period, whether engineers checking on the dam's early performance or simply travelers curious to see what had been built, often remarked that the change seemed to happen at a pace too slow to notice day by day, and yet unmistakable when measured against what they remembered from a visit even a season before. A rock that had marked the water's edge on one visit stood submerged on the next. A slope that had been dry scrub became a shoreline. The transformation asked for patience of anyone who wished to witness it, in the same way that the building of the dam itself had asked for patience of those who raised it. What emerged as the water continued its slow ascent was a body that the desert had never held before, and by every account available, had not held within the memory of any people who had lived along that stretch of river. Lake Mead, as it would come to be named, spread backward from the dam for many miles, filling the canyon and then the wider basin beyond it, drowning old washes and dry gullies beneath water deep enough to be measured in the hundreds of feet at its greatest point near the dam itself, where before there had been only the thin ribbon of the river, threading its way between walls of rock under a sky that offered little shade and less mercy. There was now an expanse, broad enough that a boat crossing it might, in places, lose sight of either shore. The desert had not become less a desert in any broader sense. The surrounding land remained as arid and unforgiving as it had always been, the heat as punishing, the vegetation as sparse. But at its center now sat this immense stillness of water, catching the light of the sky in a way the moving river never had, reflecting the canyon walls back upon themselves in the calm hours of morning and evening. The dam's early performance, once the reservoir had begun to rise and the powerhouse had begun its work in earnest, offered the first true measure of what the years of labor had actually achieved. Water drawn from behind the dam, released through the intake towers and down through the penstocks to the turbines below, began turning generators whose output was carried outward along transmission lines strung across desert and mountain to cities that, until that point, had drawn their power from smaller. The records from these early years show a facility finding its rhythm, engineers and operators learning the particular behavior of turbines that had, in some cases, been the largest of their kind ever installed. Adjusting and calibrating as the equipment settled into sustained operation in a way that no amount of testing before installation could have fully anticipated. The amount of electricity generated in these opening years grew steadily as more of the planned generating units were brought online, each addition representing not simply more capacity, but a broader reach outward into the surrounding region, more towns and more industries drawing their power from this single point in the desert. Only a few years before, there had been nothing but a river and the rock through which it cut. The water stored behind the dam, meanwhile, began almost immediately to serve the purpose for which so much of the project had been justified in the first place. Farmland downstream in valleys that had depended for their irrigation on a river whose flow could vary sharply and dangerously from year to year, now drew from a supply regulated and made dependable by the presence of the reservoir above. Fields that had once faced the threat of drought in a lean year or flood in a heavy one, found instead a flow that could be measured and released according to need rather than according to the river's own unpredictable temperament. Cities further along the river's course and beyond it, through the aqueducts and canals that would eventually be built to carry water still further from the river's natural path, began to draw upon this same reserve, upon a body of water that existed now, not because of any natural basin the land had provided, but because of the wall of concrete that held it in place. It was in the plainest terms available to those who wrote of it at the time, a transformation of the region's basic relationship to water itself, no longer a resource to be taken as the river offered it, in whatever quantity and at whatever season it chose, but a resource that could now be stored and distributed according to human need and human planning. The towns that grew up around this new arrangement and the farmland that expanded to take advantage of the water now available to it came in time to depend upon the dam and its reservoir in a manner that would have seemed almost unimaginable to those who had first proposed the project. Entire agricultural regions, given water they could now count upon from one season to the next, expanded their acreage and their populations in step with the reliability the dam provided. Cities that drew their electricity from the powerhouse below the dam grew alongside industries that required the steady supply of power the facility could offer. Industries that in earlier decades might have hesitated to establish themselves so far from more traditional sources of energy. The dependence was not something that arrived all at once in the manner of the reservoir's own gradual filling, but accumulated slowly across the years that followed, town by town and field by field, until the entire lower stretch of the river's course had become in ways both visible and easy to overlook. Structured around the presence of a single wall of concrete standing in a desert canyon. Among those who had built the dam, and among the smaller number of engineers who had directed its design and construction, there remained, after its completion, a particular and quiet form of pride. One that the records suggest was rarely spoken of with any grandeur, but was nonetheless evident in the choices many of them made in the years that followed. A considerable number of the men who had worked the canyon during its years of construction chose to remain in the region once the dam itself was finished, taking positions at the powerhouse or with the agencies responsible for the operation and maintenance of the completed facility. Continuing in a smaller and steadier capacity the work they had once performed at a much larger and more urgent scale. For these men, the dam was not simply a structure they had helped to build and then departed from, in the manner of so many large construction projects whose workforce disperses once the concrete is set and the forms have been stripped away, but a place they continued to return to day after day. Watching the water rise behind it and the electricity flow outward from it, aware in a way that few others could be of precisely what had gone into making both of these things possible. Their pride, according to the accounts that survive, was rarely expressed in the language of triumph or achievement, but rather in a quieter satisfaction. The recognition, carried privately, that the wall of concrete now holding back an entire river, and the great expanse of water spreading behind it where desert had stood before, had passed through their own hands, their own calculations, their own long hours in the canyon heat, before settling into the permanence it now displayed to anyone who came to look upon it. The years that followed the dam's completion did not bring an end to the labor that had built it, though the nature of that labor changed. Where once the canyon had rung with the sound of drills and the calls of men guiding buckets of concrete into place, it settled now into a different rhythm. The low hum of turbines, the steady discharge of water through outlet works, the quiet vigilance of engineers whose task was no longer to raise the structure. This too was a form of building, though it drew less attention. A dam of this scale, once finished, does not simply stand and wait. It requires tending, the way that any vast machine requires tending, and the decades that followed 1935 were shaped as much by this ongoing maintenance as by the original act of construction. The powerhouse itself, wrapped along the base of the dam in its long curved wings, had been designed with room to grow, and grow it did. The 17 main generating units installed in the years immediately following completion were not the final word on the plant's capacity. Additional units were added in the decades that followed, as the demand for electricity in the growing cities of the Southwest continued to rise faster than anyone in the 1930s had quite anticipated. Los Angeles, which had been among the driving forces behind the dam's construction, continued to expand outward and upward, its population swelling through the middle of the century, and with that growth came a hunger for power that the original installation generous as it was. Additional generators were fitted into the powerhouse wings over subsequent years. Refinements were made to the turbines themselves as engineering knowledge advanced. And by the middle of the century, the plant's total output had grown well beyond what had first been imagined when the contracts were signed and the first units set spinning. The dam that had been built to answer a specific need of its own era proved capable of answering needs that had not yet fully formed at the time of its construction, a testament, if a quiet one, to the foresight embedded in its original design. The spillways, too, required attention, though their story was less one of expansion than of vigilance. The two spillways carved into the canyon walls on either side of the dam had been built to carry away floodwaters that the reservoir itself could not absorb, channeling the overflow through long tunnels and back into the riverbed below the dam. For long stretches of the dam's operating life, these spillways sat idle, their concrete channels dry, their gates closed, monitored but unused, because the reservoir behind the dam proved capable of absorbing far more of the river's variability than the river itself had ever managed on its own. But idle is not the same as forgotten. Engineers inspected the spillway structures on a regular schedule, checking for cracking, for erosion, for any sign that the concrete lining might be failing under the stresses of sun and occasional use. When floods did come, and they came on occasion, in years of heavy snowmelt or unusual storm patterns upstream, the spillways were called into service, and their performance, gauged against the calculations of the original engineers, offered a slow, ongoing confirmation. One such test came in the 1980s, when a combination of heavy winter snowfall and unusually persistent spring runoff pushed the reservoir toward levels that had rarely been approached since the lake first filled. The spillways were opened, water thundered through the long tunnels cut into the canyon rock, and for a time, the structure was asked to do precisely what it had been designed to do decades before: carry away more water than the dam and its reservoir alone could hold. The spillways performed as intended, though the event revealed some erosion within the tunnel linings that required subsequent repair, a reminder that even concrete built to endure is not built to endure without occasional care. Engineers returned to reinforce sections of the spillway tunnels in the years following, patching what the water had worn away, a small and undramatic act of maintenance that nonetheless illustrated the continuing relationship between the dam and the people charged with its upkeep. The structure had not been finished in 1935 so much as it had been begun in a form that would require attention indefinitely, a fact true of most great works, though rarely stated so plainly at the moment of their unveiling. Drought presented a different kind of test, one measured not in sudden floods, but in the slow withdrawal of water over years. The reservoir, named for the arid land it had transformed, was itself vulnerable to the very aridity it had been built to manage. In periods of below-average snowfall in the mountains that fed the river's upper reaches, the lake's level fell, sometimes significantly, exposing the pale mineral rings on the canyon walls that marked where the water had once stood higher. These fluctuations were watched closely by the agencies responsible for allocating the river's water among the states and interests that depended on it, a slow and continuing negotiation that had begun even before the dam's construction and showed no sign of concluding. The dam itself was unaffected structurally by these lower water levels. It had been built to hold back water, not to require a fixed quantity of it. But the reservoir's rise and fall became, over the decades, a visible record of the broader climate and consumption patterns across the region it served. Its shoreline, a kind of slow-moving gauge that told a story larger than the dam alone. Smaller alterations accumulated steadily across the years, each one modest on its own, together constituting a long and ongoing labor of upkeep. The elevators within the dam's body were serviced and eventually replaced wiring. Throughout the powerhouse and intake towers was updated as electrical standards advanced. The visitor facilities built to accommodate the growing number of people who came simply to look upon the structure were expanded and renovated more than once, as tourism to the dam grew into an industry of its own, drawing visitors in numbers that likely exceeded what the original planners had anticipated when they first considered whether the public should be permitted to view their work at all. Bridges and roadways surrounding the dam were adjusted, and in the 21st century, substantially rerouted with the construction of a new bypass crossing downstream, built in part to relieve the dam itself of the vehicle traffic that had crossed its crest for decades. A traffic load the original structure had never been designed to bear indefinitely. Each of these changes, taken alone, might seem incidental to the dam's core function. Taken together, they reveal an institution. For the dam had become something like an institution by this point, as much as a structure that required continuous reinvestment simply to remain what it had always been. Amid all of this steady maintenance and gradual expansion, the dam's name itself became for a period a matter of quiet dispute. It had been called the Hoover Dam during its planning and early construction, a name attached to it in recognition of the president who had championed the interstate agreements that made the project politically possible. But in the years following, amid the political shifts that accompanied a change in federal administration, the name was officially altered by the government agency overseeing it. And for a stretch of years, the structure was known instead as Boulder Dam. A name drawn from the canyon originally proposed as its site before engineers determined that a different canyon offered firmer rock. This renaming was not without its critics, and the matter simmered quietly across the following decade, argued over in Congress and in the press, until legislation was passed restoring the name Hoover Dam permanently in the late 1940s. The dispute, viewed from a distance, illustrates something true of the structure more broadly, that even a work of concrete and steel, seemingly fixed and permanent, remained entangled in the shifting currents of politics and reputation long after its construction was complete. The river had been tamed, but the naming of the wall that tamed it remained, for a time, unsettled. Through all of this, the added generators, the tested spillways, the fluctuating reservoir, the small repairs and larger renovations, the contested and eventually resolved question of what to call it, the dam continued to perform the function for which it had been built. It held back the river. It generated power that reached across hundreds of miles of transmission lines to cities that had grown dependent on its steady output. It stored water that sustained agriculture and municipal supply across a stretch of the country that received too little rain to otherwise support the populations settled there. The decades did not diminish its purpose so much as confirm it, testing the calculations of its original engineers against seasons and demands. Those engineers could only partially foresee, and finding, again and again, that the structure held, not without effort, not without the continuing attention of those responsible for it, but held, block by block, exactly as it had been designed to do. To understand what had been raised in Black Canyon, it helps to look backward to the long and patient history of human beings attempting to hold water where it did not wish to be held. The impulse was not new. It was, if anything, one of the oldest impulses in the history of settled life. Older than writing, older than most of what survives to be studied. Hammer. Wherever people had gathered near rivers, they had eventually tried to master them, to divert a portion of the flow, to store it against the dry months, to keep the water from taking what it might otherwise take in flood. The methods had always been modest by necessity. Earthen embankments, wooden cribs filled with stone, low walls of packed clay that could redirect a stream but never truly restrain one. For most of human history, the rivers remained in the end in command. A dam might slow a river. It could not, by any means available before the 20th century, hold back a river of the size and violence of the Colorado. The 19th century had produced dams of genuine engineering ambition, particularly in the arid American West, where irrigation districts and mining operations required storage on a scale beyond what earlier centuries had attempted. Structures like the Sweetwater Dam in California and the Bear Valley Dam had pushed the boundaries of what masonry and early concrete construction could achieve, rising to heights that had seemed at the time formidable. In Egypt, the first Aswan Dam, completed in the opening years of the 20th century, had represented a similarly serious attempt to discipline the Nile, built of masonry and stretching across a significant width of river, though it would later require raising, not once but twice, as the demands placed upon it exceeded what its original builders had anticipated. In Europe, dams serving hydroelectric generation in the Alps and in Scandinavia had begun to explore concrete as a primary material, moving away from the masonry traditions that had dominated dam building for centuries. Each of these structures, in its own place and time, had represented the outer edge of what engineers believed possible. Each, in turn, had been surpassed. What set Hoover Dam apart from this lineage was not simply its size, though the size alone was considerable enough to place it beyond every predecessor by a wide margin. It was the combination of scale with a fundamentally new approach to the material itself. Earlier concrete dams, even the most ambitious among them, had been built as more or less continuous pours, or as large monolithic masses that relied on the concrete's mass and thickness to resist the water's pressure without much attention paid to what happened as that great volume of material cured. The problem of heat, of concrete's tendency to generate its own warmth as it hardened, and to hold that warmth for years within a mass thick enough to matter, had simply not been confronted at the scale Hoover Dam required, because no dam before it had been poured in a volume where the problem became severe enough to threaten the entire structure. The engineers on the Colorado had been forced to solve a problem that earlier builders had never truly faced, and, in solving it, through the interlocking blocks, through the embedded cooling pipes, through the careful monitoring of temperature that had governed the pace of the pour for more than 2 years, they had produced not merely a larger dam, but a different kind of dam, one built according to principles that would inform nearly every large concrete structure that followed. The influence did not take long to appear. Within a decade of Hoover Dam's completion, engineers working on the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington State, a structure that would eventually surpass Hoover in sheer volume of concrete, drew directly on the cooling techniques developed in Black Canyon, embedding similar networks of pipe within their own blocks and following comparable schedules for artificial curing. The methods were not treated as proprietary secrets. They had been documented, studied, and shared among the engineering community with the same thoroughness that had characterized the Bureau of Reclamation's approach to the original design, and this openness meant that the lessons learned on the Colorado became within a remarkably short span of years standard practice for concrete dam construction, wherever engineers faced the same fundamental problem of heat and mass. The block and column method, the careful sequencing of pours to allow adjacent sections to cool before grouting, seal them together, the use of refrigeration on a scale previously reserved for industrial cooling rather than construction sites, all of it entered the shared vocabulary of dam engineering. Cited in technical papers and taught to a generation of engineers who would go on to build the great dams that followed across the mid-20th century. That generation built prolifically, and much of what it built owed a visible debt to the work in Black Canyon. The Tennessee Valley Authority, established only a year before Hoover Dam's completion, would go on to construct dozens of dams across the American Southeast, drawing on techniques and personnel that had passed through the Colorado River project. Internationally, the pattern repeated. Dams rising in Brazil, in India, in the Soviet Union during the decades following the Second World War were designed by engineers who had studied Hoover Dam's construction reports, who understood the arch gravity principle it had employed at a scale not previously attempted, and who had absorbed, whether directly or through the broader circulation of engineering knowledge, the confidence that concrete could indeed be poured in volumes sufficient to restrain the largest rivers on Earth, provided the heat of its curing was properly managed. It became, in this sense, less a singular achievement, standing alone, than a hinge point in the history of the craft. The moment after which large concrete dams became not merely conceivable, but routine, undertaken by nations around the world as a standard tool of economic development, rather than as an act of singular ambition. Later dams would surpass Hoover Dam in almost every measurable dimension. The Grand Coulee Dam exceeded it in volume within a decade. The Itaipu Dam, built jointly by Brazil and Paraguay and completed in the final decades of the 20th century, would generate far more electricity. The Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River, completed in the early 21st century, would surpass every prior structure in scale of generation and in the sheer audacity of its ambition, holding back a reservoir large enough to have required the relocation of more than 1 million people from the land it would submerge. Measured purely by statistics, by height, by volume, by megawatts, Hoover Dam would eventually be overtaken on every count. And yet, it retained, and retains still, a particular status within the history of engineering that these later structures, for all their scale, have not entirely displaced. It occupies the position of the dam against which other dams are still measured, not because it remains the largest, but because it was the first to prove that a barrier of this kind poured in place, engineered against its own heat, holding back a river capable of carving canyons through solid rock, could be built at all. Everything that came after was in some sense an extension of a principle first demonstrated in Black Canyon. There is a longer thread here too, one that extends back before concrete, before masonry, before recorded history, to the earliest human communities that gathered along the banks of rivers and understood, in whatever crude way their tools allowed, that the water could be made to serve rather than simply endured. The dams built along the Tigris and Euphrates by ancient civilizations, the check dams of ancient South Asia and East Asia, designed to slow monsoon runoff, the Roman dams that still stand in fragments across Spain and North Africa after 2,000 years, all of it represents chapters in a single continuous argument between human ambition, behavior of moving water. Hoover Dam did not end that argument. No structure could end it, since rivers continue to carry sediment, banks continue to erode, and even the most carefully engineered reservoir accumulates silt at a rate that eventually limits its useful life, a fact the dam's own designers understood and accounted for in their projections, estimating a functional lifespan measured in centuries rather than in the brief span of decades that had concerned earlier builders. What Hoover Dam did was advance the argument decisively, moving the contest between rivers and human ambition into a new register, one where scale itself was no longer the primary obstacle, where the question was less whether a river could be held than how long the holding could be sustained, and at what cost and to whose benefit. It remains, even now, a reference point, cited in textbooks not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a working case study. Its construction report still consulted by engineers designing dams in regions where seismic risk, canyon geometry, or reservoir capacity echo the conditions faced in Black Canyon nearly a century ago. Newer materials have emerged since its completion, roller-compacted concrete, which allows for faster placement with less heat generation, has in many cases replaced the older block and cooling method that Hoover Dam pioneered. But even where the specific technique has been superseded, the underlying confidence that made such techniques possible traces back to the same origin, to a canyon where engineers first proved that a river as fierce as the Colorado could be answered patiently and completely in poured stone. The confidence did not remain untested. In the decades following the dam's completion, engineers returned again and again to Black Canyon, not to doubt what had been built, but to understand it more fully. Every structure of such scale becomes, in time, its own laboratory, and Hoover Dam was no exception. The Bureau of Reclamation, which had overseen the original construction, continued to monitor the structure long after the last block had been poured and the last form stripped away, and this monitoring gradually became one of the longest continuous engineering studies of a single structure in the nation's history. The instruments embedded in the concrete during construction, the thermocouples that had tracked the cooling of each block, the strain meters that measured how the mass responded to the pressure of the rising reservoir, did not fall silent once the dam was finished. They continued to report quietly for years. Engineers returning to review these readings in the decades that followed found a structure behaving largely as predicted, the concrete settling into a slow, permanent equilibrium, the loads distributing through the arch and gravity sections in patterns consistent with the calculations made in the drafting rooms of the 1920s. Where the readings diverged from the original models, they diverged only slightly, and these small differences became the subject of careful study rather than concern. Later engineers came to trust the dam not simply because it stood, but because it stood in the way the mathematics said it should. Surveys conducted at intervals across the decades, some using instruments unimaginable to the original builders. Laser levels, satellite positioning, digital modeling confirmed what earlier, cruder measurements had suggested. The dam had moved, as all such structures move, in small and predictable ways. It flexed slightly with the rise and fall of the reservoir behind it, expanding almost imperceptibly under the summer heat, contracting in winter, breathing in a rhythm too slow for any eye to catch, but precise enough for instruments to record. These movements, when plotted across the years, traced a pattern of remarkable consistency, the structure behaving as a single coherent body, rather than as the more than 200 separate blocks from which it had been built. This was perhaps the quietest vindication of the interlocking key system devised in the 1930s, proof, decades later, that the blocks had indeed become one. Not every finding was purely confirmatory. Later analyses, conducted with tools far more sensitive than anything available to the original engineers, occasionally refined understanding of how certain sections of the dam distributed stress, or how the foundation grouting had aged within the canyon rock. Where these studies found minor departures from the original assumptions, they were addressed not with alarm, but with the same unhurried thoroughness that had characterized the original construction, additional grouting where seepage patterns suggested it was needed, additional monitoring where readings suggested closer attention was warranted. The dam, in this sense, was never treated as a finished object so much as a living structure requiring the same patient stewardship that had raised it in the first place. Alongside this scientific record, a different kind of record grew, one shaped less by instruments than by memory, and prone, as memory often is, to drift. Popular accounts of the dam's construction, repeated across newspapers, radio programs, and later documentaries, gathered embellishments the way any great undertaking does when it passes into folklore. Among the most persistent of these was the claim that workers who died during construction were entombed within the concrete itself, their bodies left inside the pores as the blocks rose around them. This account, dramatic and lingering, found no support in the documented record. Company records, medical logs, and the detailed procedures governing each pore make clear that concrete was placed in small, carefully monitored lifts, each one inspected before the next was added, in blocks no larger than could be properly cooled and consolidated. There was neither the physical space nor the procedural opportunity for such a thing to occur unnoticed, and no verified account from surviving foremen, inspectors, or engineers has ever confirmed it. The legend endures, as such legends do, because it speaks to something true about the danger and scale of the project, even where it fails, as a literal account of what occurred. The question of exactly how many workers died during construction has proven more genuinely difficult to resolve, though not because of any deliberate obscuring of the record. Official counts, compiled by the Bureau of Reclamation and by 6 companies, documented a specific number of deaths attributed directly to the construction site. Falls, explosions, drowning, and other accidents recorded in the logs kept by site physicians and safety officers. Yet these official figures excluded deaths from pneumonia and related illnesses, including many of the cases likely caused by carbon monoxide exposure in the diversion tunnels, which company physicians at the time attributed instead to pneumonia in order to avoid liability under contemporary labor law. Later historians, working from hospital admission records, family testimonies, and newspaper obituaries gathered from towns across the region, have argued that the true toll was very likely higher than the official figure. Though establishing a precise revised number has proven difficult given the incomplete nature of surviving records from small hospitals and company infirmaries of the period. Serious historical treatments of the dam's construction have settled not on a single corrected figure, but on an honest acknowledgement that the documented count understates the human cost, without claiming false precision about the scale of that understatement. This is, in its way, a more truthful account than either the official minimization of the time or the inflated tallies that later circulated in popular retellings, some of which pushed the figure into ranges entirely unsupported by any surviving documentation. Modern inspection of the dam continues on a rhythm established many decades ago and refined since. Bureau of Reclamation engineers conduct regular examinations of the concrete surface, the drainage galleries threaded through the dam's interior, and the intake towers rising from the reservoir, watching for the fine hairline cracking that is expected and accounted for in a structure of this mass, and distinguishing it from anything that might suggest genuine deterioration. Divers periodically examine the upstream face and the outlet works below the waterline, portions of the dam that no land-based inspection can reach. Seismic monitoring equipment, installed and upgraded across the decades as earthquake engineering advanced, watches for any tremor that might affect the structure, though the canyon's underlying rock has, across nearly a century of records, shown remarkably little seismic activity of consequence. Reinforcement work, where it has occurred, has been targeted and modest. Additional grouting in the foundation, periodic resurfacing of spillway sections subjected to the abrasive force of released water, updates to the intake and power systems as turbine technology has advanced far beyond what the original 1930s generators could offer. The dam's body, the great mass of concrete itself, has required remarkably little structural intervention, a fact that engineers studying it consistently cite as the clearest evidence that the original design and construction achieved what it set out to achieve. Behind these instruments and inspection stand the people who have devoted careers to understanding this single structure. Historians working through the archives of the Bureau of Reclamation, through the personal papers of engineers like Frank Crowe, through oral histories recorded with aging workers before their memories were lost entirely, have spent decades reconstructing the human and technical story of the dam's construction with increasing precision. Structural engineers, some trained generations after the last block was poured, have made careers of modeling the dam's behavior, testing the assumptions of the original design against modern computational methods, and confirming again and again the soundness of decisions made by men working with slide rules. Some of these later engineers have spoken of a particular humility that comes from studying Hoover Dam closely, a recognition that despite the enormous gap in available technology, the reasoning of the original design team holds up remarkably well against modern scrutiny. This convergence of evidence, the instrument readings, the surveys, the corrected historical record, the ongoing inspections, has produced something rare in the study of any large historical undertaking, a structure whose true story can be told with a fair degree of confidence. Myths gently set aside, not through argument, but through the patient accumulation of documentation. What remains when the legends are cleared away is not a lesser story, but a truer one. A project marked by genuine human cost, honestly, if imperfectly recorded, and an engineering achievement that has borne up under nearly a century of scrutiny, as well as it has borne up under the weight of the water behind it. The concrete does not know how old it is. It cannot count the years the way the historians and the engineers count them, cannot mark the passage of the decades in the way that a human hand might mark them on a calendar. And so it simply continues as it has continued since the last block was placed and the last form was stripped away to stand where it was set down, holding back the river it was built to hold. Nearly a century has passed since the first concrete was poured into the canyon, and the dam remains, by any measure that engineers apply to such things, sound. The face is still smooth where the forms shaped it smooth, streaked now in places with the pale mineral trails that decades of seeping moisture leave behind, but unbroken, uncracked in any way that threatens its purpose. Still doing on this morning precisely what it did on the morning the water was first allowed to press against it. The lake still lies behind it, drawn down in dry years and restored in wet ones. Its level, a slow-moving record of drought and snow melt, written across the face of the canyon walls in the pale bathtub ring that marks how high the water once stood. The river still arrives from the north, still carries its silt and its cold, still meets the wall of concrete and is turned aside, forced downward into the intake towers, drawn through the steel penstocks, spun through the turbines and released, quieter and more measured, into the channel below. It happens today as it happened in the 30s, in the 50s, in every decade since, an unbroken sequence of arrivals and departures, the river remade into something that behaves, that arrives more or less when it is wanted, and in more or less the quantity that is wanted. A transformation so complete and so enduring. Standing at the rim of the canyon, to forget that a wild river ever ran here at all. It is worth pausing near the end of this account to consider what was actually accomplished, stripped of the language of superlatives that so often attaches itself to a project of this scale. A river that flooded without warning and receded without warning, that carried more water in a bad year than the land around it could safely absorb, and carried too little in a dry one for the crops that depended on it, was made steady. A region without reliable electricity was given a source of power large enough to light cities that did not yet exist when the first survey stakes were driven into the canyon floor. A desert was given water enough to become farmland, and farmland enough to become, in time, some of the most productive agricultural land in the nation. None of this was inevitable. None of it followed automatically from the pouring of concrete into a canyon. It followed from thousands of specific decisions made under specific pressures by specific people whose names have been recorded with varying degrees of completeness. The engineers who calculated the loads and the temperatures and the cooling schedules, the surveyors who mapped the canyon walls, the laborers who mixed the concrete and set the forms and rode the cableways in open buckets 400 feet above the riverbed, the cooks who fed them, the wives who kept the boarding houses, the children who grew up in a town built for a project with an end date, not knowing yet that the dam would outlive the reasons that built it. The desperation of the moment in which it was conceived deserves to be remembered honestly, because it explains a great deal about how the project came to be built at all, and built as quickly as it was. Nation in economic collapse does not undertake works of this scale lightly, and it does not undertake them for reasons of engineering alone. The dam was, among other things, an answer to a crisis of employment, as urgent as the crisis of water. It addressed a demonstration that a government could still act, could still build, could still put men to work, and produce something durable in return for their labor. That desperation shaped the pace of construction, the willingness to work through the summer heat rather than pause for it, the acceptance of dangers that a less urgent age might have addressed more slowly. It also shaped the ambition of the design itself. A dam built not merely to hold water, but to generate power at a scale that would justify its cost many times over, to irrigate land that would in turn justify the water it stored, to become in effect an engine for an entire region's transformation, rather than a single structure serving a single purpose. The engineers who designed it were not merely solving a hydraulic problem. They were solving an economic one, a political one, and in the choices made about height and thickness and the arrangement of the intake towers, those pressures are legible to anyone who reads the record closely. And yet, for all the political and economic urgency behind the project, what it finally came down to in the canyon itself was a contest between calculation and material, between the ambitions of the engineers and the stubborn physical limits of stone, water, and heat. The dam could not simply be willed into existence by the need for it. It had to be built according to the actual behavior of concrete as it cured, according to the actual strength of the bedrock beneath it, according to the actual pressure that a column of water 300 feet high would exert against a wall of any given thickness. Every solution devised in the canyon, the cooling pipes threaded through the blocks, the interlocking keys that let each block share its load with its neighbors, the drainage galleries built into the dam's interior to relieve the pressure of any water that found its way through the concrete, was a negotiation with those limits, not a triumph over them. The dam stands not because ambition overcame material, but because ambition was disciplined enough, patient enough, and humble enough in its engineering to work within what the material and the ground would actually allow. That discipline is, in its own way, the most impressive part of the story, more impressive than the scale of the numbers or the drama of the setting, because it required the engineers to accept limits rather than defy them, and to build something that would last precisely because it respected the behavior of the concrete. It is a discipline that has continued in the decades since, in the quieter labor of the engineers who have maintained the dam long after its builders were gone, the inspections, the instrument readings, the small repairs, the seismic studies, the periodic reassessments of a structure that was designed with the knowledge of its error and has had to be continually re-examined in light of everything learned since. That ongoing attention is itself a kind of monument, less visible than the dam, but no less important to its survival, a reminder that no structure of this size maintains itself, that the wall stands today not merely because it was well built, but because it has been well watched. There is a particular kind of morning in the canyon when the light comes low and gold across the water, striking the downstream face of the dam before it reaches the desert floor beyond, catching the pale curve of the concrete and throwing the intake towers into long shadow across the lake. In that light, the dam looks for a moment less like a machine than like a piece of the canyon itself, as though the rock had simply risen here in a smooth, unbroken arc, rather than been poured and cured and lowered into place, block by numbered block over 5 years of labor. The water moves quietly through the generators at the base, a sound felt more than heard, a low, continuous hum that has not stopped, except for maintenance, since the turbines were first brought online. Somewhere inside the dam, in the galleries drilled through its interior, instruments still record the small movements of the structure as it responds to the temperature and the pressure of the seasons. Numbers logged now by computer, where they were once logged by hand, the same patient watching that has continued since the earliest years. And the canyon walls, granite and diorite, that were tested and drilled and grouted nearly a century ago, continue to do what they were asked to do, holding the abutments of the dam as firmly as they have always held them. Indifferent to the passage of the years, having been there long before the river was tamed and prepared. It seems to remain long after every account of the taming has been written and revised and written again. That is where this story rests, not with a dramatic ending, because there is none, but with a structure still standing, still working, still holding back a river that once could not be held, in a canyon where the morning light still finds the same concrete face it found on the day the water first began to rise behind it. If this kind of quiet, patient history is the kind of company you enjoy while drifting toward sleep, there are more great structures waiting to be told this way, gathered gently on this channel, for whenever you'd like to return to them.